So for a long time, the European powers have dominated the world. They colonized Africa to pillage and plunder it its natural resources. To this day, they send their armies to Africa to tame the governance of those regions to keep them colonized. Manifest Destiny treats South America like a banana republic, to be tamed and harnessed with Manifest Destiny. The Middle East has been warmongered for the love of producing the world's gasoline that's pegged on American greenbacks currencies. That gives the America the advantageous position to have the world reserve currency, and all the gasolines that flow through the world has to be bought in American dollars when it comes to petrol. Asia has been divided and conquered to be sweatshops, indentured laborers. Ever since the British Empire and the American Empire, Asia is their sphere of influence, and they divide and conquer those regions by toppling their nations and divide and conquering them. Even Europe is held captive to America's greenback petrodollar because Europe's GDP is kept inferior compared to the European individual sovereign currencies within their Eurozone GDP numbers. And so America is a land that controls the whole world money supply through energy. Through energy, America can starve any nation into the dark ages. It can put the brakes on a nation's transportation industry by afflicting OPEC House of Salt. If America wanted to use economic weapons, they can use their currency to sanction a nation's devaluate a nation's currency with tariffs and sanctions on the particular nations that they feel like focusing on and devaluating their currencies through the International Monetary Fund, the Bank of Settlements, the Bank of Swift, the not the banks, the bank system of Swift, the World Bank. These are systems that were set up ever since after World War One, the League of Nations, and then evolved into the United Nations, and then eventually Europe was formed into the European Union because of America and their foreign policies. That America became a sole superpower. But it was all derived by foreign policies of America controlling the guidance of the European Union. In other words, Europe was not in a position to talk about leadership when it came to world order after World War II, but America was. America had the world's sole super weapon, nuclear weapons, and America was the only one that was left untouched by when it came to America's infrastructure. But while the rest of Europe was in ruins, the rest of Europe after World War II and World War One was all weakened, and so Europe had to follow the lead of America as a sole superpower ever since. So Europe has been playing second fiddle to America's foreign affairs. And so that's why even to the GDP of these countries, let me mention for 2022, America GDP was $25.3 trillion. Now let's take the European nations. Even though they have the Eurozone currencies, but they still individually separated when it comes to their own nation's GDP. So it's not like America. America has one currency, one union, and our GDP is just for the whole entire nation. Europe is different. Europe has their sovereign GDPs that represents their nation's surplus or deficit or production of a PPP or GDP. So the Europe is not like the American economy. Like I said, the American economy has just one GDP, but Europe has their own individual GDPs. And so it's trickle down economics when it comes to America's petrodollar, when it comes to European GDPs. Take, for example, Germany for 2022, their GDP was $4.3 trillion. France GDP for 2022 was $2.9 trillion. Netherlands GDP was $1 trillion. Austria GDP was 480 billion. They didn't even get to be a trillion. They just had it in the billions. Austria was 48 480 billion GDP. Norway, their GDP for 2022 is 542 billion. Sweden GDP was 621 billion. Finland GDP was 298 billion. Denmark GDP was 390 399 billion for Denmark. Switzerland GDP was 842 billion. And these are yearly GDPs. The United Kingdom, they separated from the Eurozone, but their GDP was for 2022 3.4 trillion. Italy's GDP was 2.1 trillion. Spain GDP was 1.4 trillion. So you start to see that compared to the to America, these nations in Europe are inferiors when it comes to their individual GDPs. They're stuck in. They can't compare their GDPs to America GDP. America GDP is 25.3 trillion, and America pegs the whole world to the greenback. So any country that wants to sell their oils to any other country has to do it in American currency. And so that's why the European Union, although they're united with the Eurozone economies, they still have their own national GDPs. So they only have access to their own GDPs. They don't have access to every other GDPs. So in the European Union, their European nations are separately depending on their own individual GDPs. Unlike America. America only has one grand GDP, which is 25.3 trillion. But Europe doesn't have that advantageous positioning because Europe doesn't control the petrodollar. So that gives the advantageous positioning of America to take advantage of Europe as inferior currencies when it comes to GDPs, because Europe is fragmented. Every nation in Europe, in the European Union, has their own GDPs. That with that they can support their government fundings. They can support their budgets with their own individual GDPs. Now they might have their Eurozone currency, all the same currency, but they still have separate GDPs. So they can only tax and support their government budgets based on their individual GDPs towards their own nations as member states of the Union. So they're poor. They're all poor compared to America's GDP, because the majority of them are only in the hundreds of billions as far as yearly GDP, and only some of them, like France, Germany, and UK, and Italy and Spain made it into the trillions, but the lower trillions. Like I said, Germany GDP for 2022 was 4.3 trillion. United Kingdom, they're no member. They're separate from the Eurozone, but their GDP was 3.4 trillion. France, 2.9 trillion. Spain, 1.4 trillion. Italy, 2.1 trillion. Now, like I said, their GDPs they only have access to their own GDPs as individual member states. They don't have access to every other nation's GDPs. That don't belong to them because they're sovereignly independent when it comes to their GDPs. So you know how in America we tax our citizens to support government spending? Well, as in the European nations, they only have access to their own GDP as far as a tax base. They can't tax every other nation members in the union. In other words, they can borrow interest with the Eurozone currency through the banking system. They can borrow currencies, but as far as them paying back, they only have their own tax base of their own individual nations that is dependent on those individual nations and their GDPs. So compared to America, America has 25.3 trillion to play with when it comes to GDP as far as tax derivative base. But these European nations, they have inferior GDP taxing base. So you start to see that they're way, way, way poorer than America when it comes for their tax base of their countries that's reliant on their GDPs. So Europe is inferior because they're stuck in individual GDPs that is way, way, way lower than America's GDP as far as the tax base is concerned. So they're limited. Germany is only limited to their GDP for 2022, which was 4.3 trillion. France is only limited to their GDPs, which is 2.9 trillion. So France can only tax their government based on their GDP, which is 2.9 trillion. Germany, like I said, has a GDP for 2022 of 4.3 trillion. So Germany, the government of Germany, can only tax their government base of the private sector based on their GDPs, which is a total of 4.3 trillion. United Kingdom can only tax their government citizens based on their GDPs, which is 3.4 trillion. So you start to see that as far as GDP taxing base, these countries are way, way inferior. They don't have access to as much money as America has when it comes to America's GDP. And why America has a strong GDP is because they supply the petrol gasoline flow through all nations as the petrodollar. In other words, all the oils, petrol that is sold throughout the world has to be done in American currency. So America derives purchasing power because America can devaluate every other nation's currencies with economical sanctions. And America owns these organizations in Europe. America dictates to these European organizations, the International Monetary Bank, the World Trade Organization, the SWIFT, the Bank of Settlements. All of that is located in Europe, but it was derived after World War I and World War II, when America was an industrial powerhouse, and we had the world's super weapon. And so America dictated to the European Union what was the accords to be accorded when the European Union was founded. And so America to this day, because America has the only leverage, hegemony over the world, which is to control the supply of gasoline and diesel in petrodollars, American greenbacks. In other words, imagine if a nation is denied gasoline. Their vehicles will come to a halt. A nation transportation industry will come to a halt. That means a nation economy will be crippled if denied fuel. And if that fuel importation is only to be done with American greenbacks, you can start to see the leverage of economical weapon that the petrodollar is. And that's why America dominates these organizations that control the world banking systems that are strategically in Europe, but America dominates it when it comes to America's sole superpower and America's foreign policies to this very day. And like I say, Europe is trickle-down economies with their GDPs, because they only can tax and support their own citizens of their own countries as member states of the European Union based on their individual nation's GDPs, which is separate and sovereign from every other nation's GDPs. So every nation in European unions only have access to tax derivatives of their populations of their own countries based on their individual nation's GDPs. So they're way poorer than America. It's trickle-down economics for the European Union. Even though they have their own currency that is united, is the Eurozone currency, but they have their own sovereign debt as member states. They have their own sovereign debts as member states. And these sovereign debts can only get paid off as member states based on their national sovereign individual GDPs of their nations individually. So if they only have access to so much GDP, which is way, 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 way lower than America's capability, that means that the European member state can only tax their citizens but so much to support their debt obligations to the Eurozone organization as the Eurozone currency. So they only have limited tax-based derivatives based on their national separate sovereign GDPs. Like I said, France GDP for 2022 was 2.9 trillion. So France can only tax but so much the French citizens based on that GDP, which is 2.9 trillion. France can only do but so much when it comes to supporting their government programs, supporting social programs for their citizens, and to derive taxes to govern their governance of their government. So they only have a base of 2.9 trillion GDP. So they can only tax but so much based on that GDP, which makes them way poorer than America compared to America. America has 25.3 trillion. So let's take Germany. Germany GDP for 2022 was 4.3 trillion. That means Germany can only tax but so much their peoples based on that GDP 4.3 trillion. Spain had 1.4 trillion GDP. That means Spain can only tax but so much based on 1.4 trillion. They're limited to that little bit of money as a base of GDP. Italy had 2.1 trillion. So Italy is limited with tax derivatives of their Italian citizens. They can only tax but so much of 2.1 trillion GDP. So you start to see that Europe is way poorer with trickle-down economics compared to the world order of America. America has a combined GDP of 25.3 trillion. And America has the greenback enslaving the whole world to the whims of gasoline. That when America decides to use sanctions, economic sanctions, they can devaluate any other nation's currencies and give any other nation currencies hyperinflation. And since every world in the nation has to buy oil in American dollars, you can see the power in that. Can't y'all see the power in that? Can't you see the hegemony, the totalitarian rule of economical might of that? It's basically a weapon to cripple any nation at will. Every nation, their industries depends on the transportation system of their nations. In other words, the transportation flow is the lifeblood of every nation's economy. The transportation flow of every nation is the lifeblood. It's like the arteries, the veins that supports the nation economy, the transportation. And if every nation has to buy gasoline with American greenback dollars, then you can start to see that America can cripple any nation overnight. They can cripple any nation, by denying them access to gasoline for fair prices. America can raise or give hyperinflation to a country so they have hard time importing gasoline into their countries, which causes nation unrest, social unrest, rebellions, hyperinflations when America inflicts sanctions on their currencies and on their markets. And it can cause any nation in the third world to be overthrown. Then let's go back to Europe, because I like to point out to the European members the trickle down economics of their GDPs compared to America's. And the majority of the European Union member states, like Austria, their GDP was 480 billion. So they can only tax their citizens based on their GDP, which is 480 billion. Norway, GDP was 542 billion. So they can only tax 542 billion worth of citizens in their private sectors. So they only have a tax base of 442 billion. Sweden only has a tax base of 621 billion based on their GDP. So they don't even get to even get out of the billions as far as national GDP. They can't get out of the billions. In other words, they can't even afford to have $1 trillion GDP. They're so poor when it comes to their GDPs. They don't even get out yearly out of. They can't make it to the trillions. They're stuck in the billions. So they can only tax their citizens within their GDP. Finland had 298 billion GDP, so they can only tax so much out of 298 billion. Denmark only had 399 billion, so they can only tax so much out of their base of GDP. So even though the European Union have their currencies united to be one currencies, but they still have their sovereign debts of their own nation states, and they're separated debts. So they have to pay their own shares. They have to pay for their own membership as European Unions based on their GDP tax bases. So it's trickle down economics. It's trickle down economics compared to America's hegemony over the world. Europe is way more inferior and in a position to not even challenge America's might when it comes to the world order. Europe, like I said, they have their own sovereign debt obligations to their own nation states, and their debts are separated separately from each other. So their debt is not a union. Their debt is individually separated. It's fragmented. So they are enshackled, hold to their tax minimum base of GDPs that can't keep up with the capabilities of America. So you start to see the advantageous positioning ever since World War I, World War II, how America took advantage of Europe. To this day, America takes advantage of Europe. Europe can't compete at all with America's foreign affairs. So America uses Europe to do the whims of America's foreign affairs. In other words, to follow suit, to be second in command, to be following behind America lead. What America wants to do in the world, Europe has to abide by it, by following everything America wants them to follow. Like I said, their individual countries can only tax so much their individual GDPs, and it's impoverished. It's trickle-down economics compared to what America has as an overall world order of schemes. So Europe, look at Russia. Let's say Russia's GDP for 2022 was 1.8 trillion. Poland GDP was 700 billion. So they can only tax but so much of 700 billion. Hungary GDP was 198 billion. So Hungary can only tax but so much of 198 billion. They can only tax but so much. So they're poor. It's trickle-down economics for the whole European Union compared to America and America's greenback as a petrol reserve, as a weapon, as a petrodollar that controls the whole supply of the world energy through they can cripple any nation by denying a nation access to gasoline with the petrodollar. They can devaluate any nation's currencies, and they can keep the European Union GDPs are kept stagnated by America intentionally. America doesn't want Europe to become more powerful than America, and America doesn't want to follow behind the lead of Europe. America doesn't want to play second fiddle to Europe. So that's why Europe, even though they have the European Union and they have the Eurozone currency, but they still stagnated with their own separate individual fragmented GDPs, which gives the advantageous positioning to America with the petrodollar to lead and call the shots when it comes to the IMF, the WTO, the Bank of Settlements, the SWIFT. And it's all being controlled by America. Those strings are being pulled by America when it comes to the overall world economic order. So, since America has the world pegged to gasoline, and it props up our fiats, that America can print money out of thin air and have hegemony over all nations by denying them access to energy, and having the number one weapon as a currency to devaluate any nation's currencies and to deny them energy. Literally, you could cause a nation to be toppled overnight because America has the hegemony of gasoline over the world. And so even Europe can't compete with America. Asia has been made into a sweatshop for hundreds of years. Europe has been dividing Asia into sweatshops as far as countries being toppled and governed for labor, cheap labor. Africa has been colonized over and over again and kept poor. The Middle East has been genocidally warmongered for the love of gasoline. Latin America, South America has been colonized as peasant lands of manifest destiny to keep their regions as banana republics or cheap agricultural countries of Latin America, which are denied the advanced technologies and infrastructures. And America doesn't want Latin America to unite. South America, I mean. America doesn't want South America to unite and to become an economical powerhouse because it threatens America's rule. So between Canada and America, they keep South America impoverished as third world Latino countries. They rather see them developing as a country sugarcane, coffee, bananas, They like to brag about South America as banana republics. The Atlantic Fruit Company kept America dirt poor ever since the origins of the laws of the oceans, the laws of the open seas. Before the League of Nations, there was only the laws of the open seas. When the old world came to the new world, and they colonized the Americas and indigenously drove back the natives to colonize the colonies of Eastern North America colonies that spread into the frontiers of the Western push. They annexed territories of Mexico to come up with states of Texas, California, and other regions that they annexed off of Mexico. Canada did the same for their territories with Britain and France. So between the old world and the new world, they took away half of the Americas, the north regions of the Americas, this western order of the old world coming into the new world. And in today's contemporary time, South America is a land of peasant brown natives that happen to speak Spanish. And so America likes to refer to these regions as banana republics as a slide to their thumbing their noses at Latin America. Because in North America, when you see the news, American pundits say, "Oh, America is not a banana republic." In other words, like we impose banana republics, but America is not a banana republic. Like we're too waspy and above that. We don't consider ourselves inferior brown natives and their banana plantations. So America refuses to be a banana republic. That's what they basically mean when they say, "Oh, America is not a banana republic." It's because they thumbing their nose down with manifest destiny to South America. Like we're better than you, we're above you, we're beyond you. We don't consider ourselves like your republics. So every time you hear an American news outlet in America say, "Oh, America is not a banana republic," we refuse to be a banana republic. It's like them thumbing their nose down to the agricultural countries of South America that America depends. Even America's farmlands has been supported by migrant slaves that have been indoctrinated as undocumented workers to be exploited in America's farms. To this very day, America feeds itself off of the exploitation and trafficking of undocumented workers to prop up America's farmlands throughout the country. To this day, these Latino migrants has been exploited like undocumented laborers. And America has an obesity problem off of it. The same for America's construction industries. Their landscaping companies, their construction companies are filled with undocumented workers from Latin America. The same thing for the homekeepers, housemaids, They're all undocumented workers. America feasts off these migrants to to make themselves in their gerrymandered, uh, gentrified neighborhoods throughout the country, and as middle class white Americans. And while you have people like Trump saying these migrants are rapists, criminals, lowlives, they're not sending us their best. They're not you, they're not you, as he points at his white supporters at his rallies. They're not you, they're not you. They're not sending us their best. These are criminals, lowlives, rapists. And in reality, America has exploited laborers to this very day for undocumented exploited laboring at the American farmlands of this country. At America's construction, while they gerrymander and gentrify their neighborhoods, they do it on off the sweat of undocumented workers as laborers in the construction fields, and their landscaping companies, while they while they mold and keep the landscape of these middle class suburban white neighborhoods with undocumented workers, of people that are exploited laborers as landscaping employees, forced laborers as undocumented workers to be exploited. So America still profiteers and exploits these migrants as sharecroppers in America's industries and in America's farmlands. And then you have a fascist pig party like Trump demagoguing their human integrities as they're being exploited as undocumented workers. You got people like Trump that shits on their integrities, human integrities, while America turns a blind eye to their sharecropping and indentured servitude of these undocumented migrants. That Capitol Hill knows exactly what's going on in these industries, whether it be the landscaping industries, the housekeeping industries, the construction industries, or the agriculture industries. Washington grows rich off of it. So that to this day they refer to Latin America with manifest destiny, thumbing their waspy nose at them, saying that America is not a land of banana republics. In other words, like, we impose banana republics, but we refuse to be considered equal. They're inferior brown lands with brown migrant natives that happen to speak Spanish, the bastard children of a Spanish empire. They inherited their Spanish language, but they're natives Americans of the Americas. And we call them Spics because they speak Spanish of a bygone empire. America said to Puerto Rico and Cuba when they were colonies of Spain, America said with manifest destiny, we will liberate y'all and give y'all your freedoms and democracies. And in reality, they were trying to colonize them, like they did to the Borinquen soldiers that fought to liberate Cuba from the crown of Spain, only for the Borinquen soldiers in Puerto Rico to become a land of imprisoned colonies. To this day, America doesn't let Puerto Rico vote for America's presidents through the elections of our presidential 4 years of cycle of voting for our presidents. Puerto Rico doesn't have the right to be considered part of the Union, let alone to have the power to vote for who they want America's presidents to be, as far as being citizens, because they're a commonwealth, an imprisoned island, while the Federal Reserve keeps by the Fed keeps their records in Puerto Rico, and the Treasury has it in that they can't audit the Federal Reserve because it's all set up as a tax haven. So in other words, they use Puerto Rico as an excuse not to pay taxes. Wall Street and the corporations that do stock exchanges through the Federal Reserve, they park their audit records in Puerto Rico as a Commonwealth territory. But since they're not part of the Union, the IRS can't audit Puerto Rico the same way they audit the Union of America. So it's a loophole for the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve to use Puerto Rico as a tax haven. For people like Trump, can say corporate inversions of tax haven money to be corporate inverted back into these stock shares to prop up their stock holdings and their industries of commerce. while he tossed paper towels at Puerto Rico like that's some type of compensation for them to be imprisoned in a colony of peasantries, of brown peoples that speak. They call spics because they said these are native Tainos that happen to speak Spanish, just like the rest of South America. And so Manifest Destiny bears down on South America like we're a land of peasants. And to this very day, America uses and exploited these migrants and then has the fascist pig party of Trump to demagogue their human integrities, to rob them of their decencies, to be considered equal as human beings, while they be exploited in the construction fields of America, in the landscaping fields of America, while they gentrify neighborhoods to white gerrymandered neighborhoods. They build their neighborhoods with the exploitation of undocumented workers. They maintain their lawns, their bushes, their housekeeping to undocumented workers. They feed the lands, the stores, and the produce that are in the store shelves of all supermarkets throughout this country is from the exploited labors of undocumented workers. To this very day, America enslaves these migrants to be sharecroppers. And then they want them to, like Lindsey Graham and the Republicans, they want these exploited documented workers to be fined steeply for being exploited, but they want them to get in line 3 times and come to this country as guest workers. At the same time, they got to get back in the line when it comes to the migration to apply for citizenship. So they got to get steeply fined. They lost all their money as sharecroppers, and now they got to get them back in the line to apply for citizenship, and they got to come as guest workers 3 more times before they even considered the right to consider them as citizens. It's more prolonging of exploitations, these policies by these good old boys. At the end of the day, this Manifest Destiny treats South America as indignant servants. That they thumb their nose with stench in their waspy societies, thinking that brown peoples are inferior to the American culture. To this day, in their English tongues, they call us spics because we're native brown, native of the Americas that happen to have been colonized by the old world into the new world. And we inherited the Spanish language as South Americans. The same way they treated Africa as slaves to be imported into the cotton fields of southern plantations. The same way they apartheid India to be colonies of the British Crown. They imported opiates into China from India because the settlers of the slave plantations, they used the cottons to buy the opiates from India. They import slave cotton-picked cottons from the Americas, imported it to India for India can do their textiles, but then India paid them with opiates, and they used that opiate to flood China with it. The kingdom of the United Kingdom, when Britain was an empire before America took over. So Asia has been dominated as sweatshops. America warmongered Japan, the Koreas, Vietnam, the Philippines. Basically, Asia has been supporting the never-ending greed of cheap production goods that are made in Asia and imported into Western countries. Asia has been there just to be pillaged and plundered as cheap laborers to produce the textiles and commodity and the goods of all produce of manufacturing capabilities to be exported for cheap pennies on the dollars into Western Europe countries. So Europe has only grown gluttony by consuming as much exports from Asia as possible. America split North Korea into 2, made South Korea into America's sweatshop. We made Japan after we bombarded into submission with 2 nuclear bombs attacks. We made Japan into our sweatshops. We divided the Chinas into Taiwan, made Taiwan into our sweatshops. We warmongered the Vietnamese, and now we want to create Vietnamese sweatshops. Now we're to Western Europe is too afraid of China's economy because they had a heavy population. So they overnight they rose up as an economical powerhouse. Now America is afraid of China's economy. So now America wants to drive back China into an impoverished rice paddy field economy, agricultural impoverished regions like they were once before America, Deng Xiaoping and Nixon made their trade deals. The Middle East has been warmongered genocidally for the never-ending supply of gasoline. For more than 100 and some odd years of the gasoline combustion engine. To this very day, America depends on the hegemony of floating gasoline throughout the world with the petrodollar. That props up the Treasury Department selling bonds, security bonds, treasury bills for third world nations to buy reserve currencies in America's debt obligations, just for America to pull the rugs underneath their feet whenever America experiences a hiccup of inflation or high interest rates. These other third world nations that thought they had security invested in America's currencies with their bonds and their reserves, it gets wiped out overnight just because of the whims of the American markets. And then these third world nations are stagnated to pay their national debts. While they thought they were having their investments in secure investments by having their investments in American currency reserves or American treasury bills or security bonds. So you start to see even the European unions with their inferior GDP base, they can only tax their government so much to support their tax obligations because they have their own GDPs, individual GDPs. So let's go again to the European GDPs. Let's go again to European GDPs. Ireland GDP for 2022 was $516 billion. That's their yearly GDP. So they can only tax their citizens but so much to support them as member states of the European Union. They only have access to $516 billion worth of tax derivatives based on their productions of their GDP base. Austria has 480 billion in GDP. So they can only tax by so much their populations because they only have 480 billion yearly tax derivatives out of their GDPs. Switzerland only has 842 billion. So they can only tax that much off of the American people, off of their population. Switzerland only has 842 billion. So they can only tax so much of those billions to supply their government welfare programs or their government obligations. Denmark only has a GDP for 2022 for the year of 2022, they only have 399 billion. So Denmark can only tax that base of GDP. They can't tax each other when it comes to GDPs because they own their own sovereign debt obligations as European member states. So they're stuck with only the tax base based on their GDPs. So it's trickle-down economics. America realizes that. That's why America has the hegemony of the petrodollar, because it gives America's capabilities at GDP 25.3 trillion compared to these inferior European GDPs. And the only one that can give America a run for their money when it comes to GDPs is China. Now, America population is around 350 million American people live in North America. So America only has a population of 350 million people. China has a population of 1.3 or 1.4 billion people. So compared to America, 3 350 340 million, China has way more population. So it backfired on Nixon because when they decided to, you got to understand, all the Asian nations has been used as sweatshops for the never-ending greed of cheap production commodities that they can export from Asia into European nations. So what happened is that the population of Japan is small. The population of Taiwan is small. The population of South Korea is small. So America under Nixon realized that their economies was only limited, but so much. Because like I said, the European Union, Western countries, and America depends on the exports of Asia to supply their never-ending greed for cheap commodities to be imported into Western countries. So since Japan, Taiwan, and North Korea population was too small, they wanted to make China into the next sweatshops. And so Nixon made a trade deal with Deng Xiaoping. And so what happened overnight, China from rice paddy field, rural agriculture economy, China emerged after Deng Xiaoping and Nixon trade deals to become an industrial powerhouse. And so to this day, China is the only one that can compete with America. Even though America controls the flow of gasoline with the petrodollars throughout every country in the world, that's what gives the advantages to American economy, is to control the gasoline flow throughout the world. That's what gives America the generation of power of 25.3 trillion of GDP, because it's pegged on the inflationary demands of the world never-ending need for gasoline. That gives America derivatives when it comes to the purchasing power. Because America doesn't produce anything. America outsourced all our manufacturing to Asia. Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, China. We outsourced all our manufacturing companies to Asia. And America only has like a service sectors of corporations, white collar careers. There's no real production capability in America. All that has been outsourced to Asia countries. So America is only a land of white collar business, banking, speculators, hedge funds, companies, lawyers, accountants, that type of economy. While Asia is a production engine of the world. So China, based that China had more population than Japan, Korea, and Taiwan together, China had more population than them. So China rose up rapidly. And now America is jealous of being threatened economically and militarily wise by China. So America wants to cripple China at any cost necessary. So let me conclude. I'm against the gasoline petrodollar hegemony over the world. I want to save the planet from being destructive by carbon emissions. At the same time, I want to free and break the shackles of all nations from being imprisoned and enslaved to gasoline. I want to give all the nations the right to be self-independent in renewable energies, that all nations cannot be denied free and clean energy. I believe in all nations being sovereign, that all nations have the capabilities of having their free renewable energies. That's why I'm developing the technologies for the electric cars. So electric cars can be self-sufficient and ionized for the life of the vehicle. You never have to manually charge these vehicles. You never have to worry about paying electric bills. You never have to worry about paying gasoline or diesel bills for these vehicles. They drive themselves and they maintain their charges. In other words, these vehicles self-ionized, and for the life of the vehicle, is self-powered, is green and renewable. And so all nations' transportation systems will be freed because of people like me. All transportation systems of vehicles throughout the world will be sovereign and independent of any nation hegemony. Like America has enslaved the world to gasoline, I'm breaking those shackles. I'm vanquishing the enslavement of the world being enslaved to gasoline. I want to make all nations free renewable vehicles, that every nation has their own right to have free renewable energies, and no one nation can be kept in the dark ages by the hegemony of a gasoline pegged currency as the greenback. So I want to give all nations their liberties and freedoms for all by making sure that their populations cannot be starved and deprived and enslaved like America has done so far with the gasoline petrodollar. So I want to ensure that with my inventions, I can offer all nations' transportation systems, the lifeblood of their economies, can be sovereignly defended and independent and liberated from enslavement of the petrodollar. That is my mission in life. So I'm creating technologies that can make all nations' vehicles self-ionized, self-charged, that don't depend on enslavement of imports of a petrol gasoline, that can tariff your currencies like America has done with so far with the greenback weapon of the petrodollar as the world reserve currency that floats and keeps the world enslaved to gasoline. So my mission in life is to liberate all nations from oppression when it comes to this petrodollar hegemony. It's an economical weapon to subvert the third world into perpetual slavery of indebted third world regions of impoverished nations, that the world has been submitted by the force of the greenback to subvert the world into a perpetual motion of third world regions. To deny nations access to energy is a crime. To starve nations into submission is a crime. So that's why America has to be driven back when it comes to this hegemony of enslaving the world to the dependency and the whims of America's gasoline enslavement by Washington, D.C., imposing hegemony over the world. Not only is it an economical, political sin, but also it's destroying this planet by choking this planet with unreversible, catastrophic, unfolding effects on the planet's natural cycles. For thousands of years, it will be felt for generations to come, the ignorance of the gasoline combustion engine. It will have unreversible effects on the planet for thousands of years to come. The unreversible effects of these tonnage yearly of carbon emissions for 100 and some odd years of the gasoline combustion engine, and the effect that it will have on the planet for thousands of years to come. While this Capitol Hill is stuck on stupid like a junkie with a syringe of an oil pipeline supplying the veins of America's greed to the gluttony of the petrol gasoline dollars, like the biggest junkies that are stuck as they grow high with their never-ending desires of hegemony, of being considered the world undisputed sole superpower by enslaving the world into submission with the most destructive force of gasoline destructions on this planet. With their ignorance, they want to destroy our societies and enslave us to the whims of Washington's whims, but also they are destroying with gluttony the formations of our planets and our spheres of our planets with unreversible destructive forces as they emit tonnages and tonnages yearly of carbon emissions into the atmospheres. And these atmospheres will have these gases for thousands of years to come. So our unborn generations will have to live on a planet that is self-destructing because we're choking off the planet with the greenhouse effect that is causing this planet to disorder itself. So I want to participate in liberating the world from this detriment, abolishing gasoline, abolishing America's petrodollar, and giving every nation their freedoms and liberties when it comes to undeniable, clean, renewable energies that every nation has access to energy and can never be starved into submission or to be impoverished, like America has done with the economical weapons of devaluating nations' currencies that is pegged on the supply of gasoline, that they can drive nations into poverty by starving their infrastructures of transportation vehicles, by denying them their veins of commerce, which is supported by a nation's transportation grids of vehicles. America enslaved the whole world to the gasoline combustion engine, and now I'm here to liberate it, to vanquish the hegemony of this never-ending greed of Washington to propagate gasoline throughout the world as they peg their currency to it and force the world to abide by it. It's not only an economical sin, it's a social sin when you can keep regions impoverished throughout the world by the whims of your Washington bipartisan views of hypocrisies. But the biggest sin is destroying this planet to the point that eventually humans won't be able to live on it if we keep on these gasoline junkies with their syringe oil pipelines stuck in the veins of Washington bureaucracies, the biggest junkies on earth, with their junk bonds and their security treasury bills pegging the world into submission as they want to sell their debt obligations to the third world. While the third world think that they have some security, treasury bills and security bonds, just the slightest whim of inflation or high interest rates in America's markets causes these third world nations what they thought was secure to be wiped away instantaneously. And then they realize they are stuck in the third world, and then their national debts of currencies won't be able to keep up with their debt obligations. That's what happens when third world regions uses America as their reserve currencies, or purchase America's debt or treasury bills. They realize that it was a mirage. When it disappears, every time the markets in America goes up or down, they get wiped out like a game of roulette. So at the end of the day, I want to break the shackles of enslavement of gasoline throughout the world, and America's never-ending greed, thirst to flood the world with gasoline. It's not fair for third world nations. It's not fair for their currencies. It's not fair for their commerce. It's not fair for their sovereignties. And it's definitely not fair for their freedoms. All nations should have clean, renewable, self-sufficient energies, that not one nation can interfere with another nation's energy supplies. Not one nation can starve a nation into the dark age, like America does with their petrol gasoline dollars as economical weapons. So I want to free all the transportation of all nations equally. So as an engineer, as a physicist, I came up with technologies that make electric cars self-sufficient. So for the life of the vehicle, the car stays self-ionized. You never had to plug it in. You never had to pay electric bills. You never had to fill it with gasoline or diesel. These cars, for the life of the vehicle, stay self-charged. And I want all nations to be free. All their transportation vehicle grids, of all the transportation grids of all nations, to have vehicles that are free, clean, and renewable. So the lifeblood of all nations' economies are their transportation systems of their vehicles. And I want to make every vehicle of all nations to be liberated. For all nations can prosper and have right to their commerce, have right to their productions, have right to their transportation grids, and their vehicles to be liberated from the shackles of America's hypocrisy of the petrol enslavement of the world, of gasoline dependencies. So I want to free all the nations from this enslavement of gasoline pumps. I want to cut the purse strings of Washington when it comes to the petrol dollar of gasoline. It's not fair for the rest of the world. It is not fair for the planet. So people that are like naively con artists, like Rockefeller's father, like Trump the drifter with his snake oil remedies, demagoguing green and renewable energies, I condemn people like that. I vanquish them because their back-mindedness, their backwardedness, and all they care is about greed. Give me, give me, give me, and taking, taking, taking. It makes America look like a land of gluttony, of greedy leaders that don't have a common sense of how much they have taken from the world so far. Like Trump's tariff wars is a perfect example of greed, of gluttony. But throughout the world, it's one step at a time. I want to free all the world's transportation systems because that's the lifeblood of their veins, of their economies. A nation cannot have an economy if it's not for their vehicles and their transportations systems that depends on their vehicle going from point A to point B. Every day when people drive to their works, back, when they drive to the companies, back, when they transport cargoes with 18-wheelers, when people go to work from 9 to 5 jobs throughout the world. I want to free all of y'all for the bondage of enslavement of gasoline and the petrodollar. I want to give you vehicles that stay self-ionized for the life of the vehicle. You never have to worry about plugging them in, so you never have to pay a penny when it comes to electric bills. You never have to pay a penny when it comes to gasoline bills. You never have to pay a penny when it comes to diesel bills for your truck companies of 18-wheelers. In other words, I'm liberating the world from enslavement of the petro-gasoline hegemony that America is the number one culprit of being the slave master of.